Please welcome Jordan's parents, Lucia McBath and Ron Davis. First of all, I want to say to both of you, thank you for being here, and our deepest sympathies for the loss of your son. You know, I think people have been sickened by this story, but you all have been dealing with your grief for almost a year and a half now. And it seems to me what's been lost in the coverage is the story of Jordan himself. So Ron, tell us a little bit about Jordan, your son, your only child.
You know, when I think back, I think back to when he was little and we had the first snowfall in Atlanta, Georgia. And in the front yard there was snow, and we put his little snowsuit on. We took him out, and the first time he looked at the snow, and it looked like ice cream, I guess. And he bent down and picked it up, and he put it in his mouth, and he liked it. And all of a sudden he started frowning, because the snow was in his hand, and it was getting colder and colder. So I wiped it and put his hand in my mouth to warm his hands up, and that was his, first snowfall. I remember the first Christmas and the little train set, and the kid is sitting by the Christmas tree, and little kids, when the train goes by, they just light up, and I remember those times. I remember when he got larger and he played baseball, they had a pony league, and I remember when he wanted to show off, and he'd turn a single into a double into a triple, and the pride he had that he was fast. I also remember when he played baseball, when he was a pitcher, he was satisfied because he was in control. He's the pitcher, and every eye was on him. But then when the coach put him in left field, he didn't like that so much, because nobody looks at left fielders. So I remember those times, and as he got larger and became 16 years old. I remember his 16th birthday, we went with his friend Aaron, who's in the audience today. We went to the bowling alley, and he enjoyed that. He had his friends around, we had pizza. But my fondest memories is that he loved the beach. He was a great swimmer, much better swimmer than I am. A scuba diver, and I do other things, but he was a great swimmer. And his mother had put him in the swimming classes, and we would go to Jacksonville Beach, and we have a certain spot by the pier that we would always go. And our fondest memories is who could stand up under the waves. You see the wave coming, we turn our back to the waves, and whoever stood up to the waves the most out of 10 times won, and sometimes we tied, and sometimes he won, even though he's a little smaller than me. So
he sounds like really a typical American boy, and you have so many wonderful memories.
I do.
What were his dreams for the future? What did he want to do with his life?
Well, he wanted to, when he came out of high school, he wanted to either go in the Marines, because his first cousin was in the Marines, and he was very close with his first cousin. And also, my brother was 26 years Air Force, and so he thought about the Air Force also. We had him in ROTC in school, and so there's a picture, I believe, on there of him with the uniform on.
I know that you, Lucia, have described him as your miracle child, because you didn't think that the two of you could have children, and lo and behold, you were able to.
Absolutely. We had, I didn't have any problem getting pregnant, but maintaining the pregnancy. I had a fibroid uterus, and so had difficulties with that. Ended up having a myomectomy where they took out the posterior part of my uterus. And so we were told, chances are you probably won't be able to carry, because you don't have as much of the uterus to contain the birth. And so I just said, okay, Lord, if it's your will, it will happen.
And it did.
And it did, and it did. And it was just amazing, because I was a high-risk pregnancy. And so for those 9 months, I sat on the couch, cross-stitching, watching television, reading books, talking on the phone. I would come downstairs in the morning with Ron when he was going to work. And I would sit on the couch, and he'd prepare a big chest of food and drink for me, and I would sit there all day long until he came home. And then that was the only other time that I could go up the stairs and prepare for bed.
I know that you and Ron are now divorced. You live in Atlanta, Lucia, and Jordan was living, Ron, with you in Jacksonville.
Correct.
When was the last time you saw your son?
It was the day after Thanksgiving of 2012. And it was on Black Friday. On Thanksgiving, we had prayer, and Jordan was the actual one to lead the prayer, which normally teenagers don't do, but he led a very special prayer on Thanksgiving. And the next day, he told me that he was going to Town Center Mall in Jacksonville with his friends. He had called all his buddies up, and they were going to meet at the mall, and they were going to go a little bit light shopping and mostly look at the girls. You know how they do. And so I told him, take care. And he said, well, Dad, he said, I need a little change. I'm going to buy a little something out there. So I gave him some money to go. And then I told him I loved him. I hugged him and told him I was getting ready to go to work. And he hugged me back. And then I went to work about 2:30 that afternoon.
When you all found out that your son had been killed over an altercation about loud music, what did you think?
When I first was told, I was told that he was shot. So I didn't know he was killed. He was told he was shot, and they told me to go directly to the hospital and don't go to the scene. So it was, as you can imagine, a really excruciating drive for 30 minutes to go to the hospital, just praying that, number one, I don't hit anybody because I'm crying and I'm driving, and that maybe it's a flesh wound, maybe he just got hit in the ankle or whatever the case may be. But when I got there, they didn't have him registered or anything like that. And when I got to the back, they said, well, just wait, because of the HIPAA laws, we can't tell you who we have because the patient we have doesn't have a wallet on him. Apparently it had dropped at the scene. And I had a whole hour not knowing whether Jordan was dead or alive. And so finally, the chaplain came in with 2 policemen and also the doctor. And the first words out of the doctor's mouth was, I'm sorry, Mr. Davis, I was not able to revive. And he said a whole lot of other things, but that was the only words that my mind heard. And something just came out of me that apparently that was so, I think you have a sound inside of you that when it comes out and people hear it, they know something is wrong. And the policeman, who was 6'5", 250 pounds, started crying. The chaplain, she started crying. So the sound must have been something else. And I went to see my son, and they told me not to touch him because it was a homicide, and they had his sheet pulled up because he had gotten shot in the body, and he had a little blood on his ear, and his eye was just barely open. But, he was still Jordan. And so they told me not to touch him, but I did anyway, and I hugged him, and I talked to him. And one thing I remember doing is I smelled him. When you're a parent, you tend to smell your children. I smelled Jordan, and I didn't want that scent to ever leave, because right then and there, he was still Jordan. So when I smelled him, and I told him that God's going to take care of him now, and that I've done all I could for him on earth, and then I had to let him go.
17 years old, your miracle child. And I know that Charlie Walschlager and Aaron Johnson, as you mentioned, are here today. They weren't with Jordan that night, but they were 2 of his very best friends. And Aaron, what type of friend was Jordan?
Jordan was the goofy friend. He was always making jokes. And even if everybody was in a bad mood, he would be the one to change everybody's mood to happy. So if everybody was in a car and we was all mad at one situation, he could be mad also, but he would still be making jokes, and everybody would just forget that they were mad and be happy.
Just fun to be around, it sounds like. And Charlie, I know you and Jordan were very close. You all were homeschooled together in Atlanta. This must have been so shocking for you.
It was. I first found out over Facebook, and I just couldn't believe it. And for the first week of knowing, I couldn't even tell my mom about it. It's just so hard to not have it me anymore.
Still hard to talk about it almost a year and a half later. And I'm sure for you, Lucia, it must be really tough to talk about your son.
It's very difficult to talk about him because I always have to talk about him in past tense. Even though I know that he's present here, I can only talk about him in past tense. I can only talk about him in the form of what would have been his future. And that's very difficult to do because he was my future. I won't have grandchildren. I won't have a daughter-in-law. I won't have that extended future. I won't have, people generationally in the future that I can look at and say, that's part of me.